Go with me to South Africa in 1996 to hear about an experience that country went through and what it might say to us. South African Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu and others were holding a series of public hearings to listen to people's stories. These were actually horrible, painful accounts. There were stories of police abuse, descriptions of retaliatory violence against the police. These were official proceedings, part of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So now this is 30 years ago, and what had happened is Nelson Mandela was now leading South Africa, but there was still a cycle of anger, hurt, and revenge that was gripping their country. So many black people had been abused and mistreated by the white leadership for so long. Here was a chance to get back at these awful perpetrators. Completely understandable. But in the midst of all this turmoil, another path was offered, a more difficult and complicated way to go. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created to try to find out what actually happened. Victims and perpetrators were to come forward and tell their stories in a public hearing, and then people could apply for amnesty for their crimes in exchange for the truth. Desmond Tutu said the goal was not retributive justice, where you get back at someone for doing wrongs, but rather restorative justice in order to try to bring healing. So, for example, the story of the Guguletha 7 from 1985. What happened is 7 young black men left their home one morning in the South African township of Guguletha, and they never came back. The official version told by the government and the media was that these young men were planning an ambush and that they'd fired on the police, and the security forces fired back, defending themselves, and all 7 men were killed and were labeled as terrorists. That was the official story. 11 years later, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gathered to uncover more. A policeman actually came forward, a man named Constable Mabelo, and he said that that official story had all been lies. It was, in fact, a well-planned operation to trap these young men who they considered agitators, to eliminate them and actually plant guns on them. Constable Mabelo said he was just following orders when he did this, and that in the days following he would often stay drunk so that he wouldn't remember what he'd done. As these stories were told in this public hearing, in the audience were some of the mothers of these murdered young men, and they began to cry. Several of them threw up their hands and wailed in anguish. Desmond Tutu said to the women gathered, "May God comfort you, because we do not have words to comfort you." Face to face with these security forces who had killed their sons, what would these women do? Some of them came to the microphone and they told their stories. Some did not offer any forgiveness. Some expressed hateful stares, angry words. "How dare you? How could you do that to my child?" Constable Mabelo said, "I am sorry from the bottom of my heart for the evil I have done to you." After a while, after quite a bit of back and forth, A woman, Cynthia Nguwu, mother of one of the victims, came to the microphone and spoke. She said to Constable Mabello, "As Christopher's mother, I forgive you, my child. It is pointless to hold this wound against you. I need to get rid of the burden I am carrying inside. You and Christopher are the same age. Jesus on the cross forgave. I forgive you so that we can have peace." Incredibly, at the end of this session, Constable Mabello and some of these mothers even shared an embrace. Hard to believe. When harm is done, there can be a variety of responses, appropriate responses: anger, punishment, jail time. We don't want to ever say that there shouldn't be consequences for misdeeds and harm done. And yet we have examples like this Truth and Reconciliation Commission with its stories of forgiveness offered and received. Now, in this process, not everybody who applied for amnesty got it, and there weren't always words of remorse or forgiveness. Not everyone was satisfied. But sometimes, as they pursued truth and reconciliation, there were moments of grace that led to healing for individuals and for a country. Jesus does offer this peculiar option that we heard in today's gospel that was just read. Jesus says, "Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you, turn the other cheek. Love your enemies." What? To try to actually love your enemies? So let's be clear. This is not Mark putting any of this forward. If we want to blame anybody, it's Jesus. It's on him. He's the one giving these impossible teachings. Now, we can quickly think of lots of circumstances where this may not be the best or certainly only approach that Jesus offers. What about abusive relationships? Are we just to be doormats to violence and hate? Aren't there times to actively resist, to take a stand, to protect the defenseless? Absolutely. Sometimes what is actually just and right are appropriate punishments and harsh consequences. Okay. In the midst of this, Jesus wants us to consider some ways that seem to go, we might say, against human nature. Who doesn't want to strike back when you're hurt? A little bit of revenge, somebody getting what's coming to them, can actually feel satisfying. Let's admit it. It can. And so what about us? Maybe not in big dramatic ways. Let us pray that we never have the horrifying tragedy of those South African mothers, what they endured. But it is likely, almost guaranteed, that someone today, this week, sometime, is going to be rude to us. They're going to cheat us. Someone is going to be threatening to us, to hurt us, or people we love in some way. If not physically, then financially or emotionally. And this is tough. It is tough, people. But it's not only Jesus, it's these great spiritual teachers, Martin Luther King Jr., the Dalai Lama, and Gandhi, who invite us to consider how we are going to respond, to work on not being captured by the behavior of others. That's what they do, to resist being caught up in vengeance and striking back. Because hatred, even hatred of our enemies, can actually be destructive to our own hearts and can have us overlook the spiritual value and underlying connectedness we have with all other people, even those who oppose us. So we can say this path that Jesus offers is way more difficult and much more complicated. In a world where we are trying to stand for truth and the values of the gospel when those seem so often ignored, where we need to hold up as a highest priority, the protection of the vulnerable and the marginal in society, when we need to be forceful about justice and not passive. How do we keep doing good to, blessing, praying for, even caring about those who oppose us? Seeking forgiveness over retaliation, reconciliation over revenge. Trying to find the grace to follow the hard teachings of Jesus.